The first man they found had been set down. Not dropped, not thrown, set down, the way a mason places a stone he intends to come back to. His boots pointed east along the ballast. His arms were folded across his chest in the manner of a body already prepared for a coffin. His lantern stood upright beside his right knee, still burning, the glass unbroken, the wick trimmed short by a hand that understood how a wick is trimmed. He had been the flagman for the No. 6 work extra out of a spur camp the company records call Mile 74. He walked ahead of the locomotive at 4:30 on the morning of October 3rd, 1907, to check a length of track the rain had troubled. He was expected back in 10 minutes. He did not come back. When the fireman went looking, he walked 70 paces and found him arranged on the outside of the north rail, with his neck turned further than a neck is meant to turn, and his face composed into the expression of a man listening for something behind him. The fireman did not run. He later told the division agent he could not remember deciding to stand still. He said the woods on both sides of the cut were quiet in a way that felt attended to, as if the quiet had a direction. He said he understood, standing there, that he had been permitted to see the flagman, and that the permission would end shortly, and that he should be inside the locomotive when it did. He was inside the locomotive within 90 seconds. He did not remember covering the distance. By 6 that evening, the company had 4 bodies. By the following night, it had 7. By the end of the week, the district superintendent had closed a section of the line under a false pretext and wired the head office for men who could shoot. The telegrapher at the division, Elias Horner, kept a private log alongside the company log, and it is from Horner's private log, held 61 years in a family trunk in Duluth, that the shape of what happened in that stretch of forest can be reconstructed at all. The company's public record says a bear was destroyed and the line reopened. The company's public record is a lie. The line ran north through a country not yet fully surveyed. The maps the crews carried had been finished at a drafting table from a canoe survey done in a hurry the previous summer, and the drafters had left long, empty rectangles where the timber closed over the streams and made the ground unreadable from above. Into those rectangles the railroad had cut a grade 40 feet wide, strung a single telegraph wire on poles at intervals of 132 feet, and run its work extras and supply trains through country no one on the drafting table had ever walked. The camp at Mile 74 was a bunkhouse, a cookhouse, a tool shed, a stable for 4 draft horses, a water tank fed by a wooden flume from a creek half a mile east, and a section boss's cabin no larger than a stall. 23 men were on the roll on October 1st. By October 8th, the roll had been rewritten twice, and neither version matched the number of graves the company would eventually pay to have dug. The section boss was Alden McCrae. He had worked the northern grades 18 years and had the reputation of a man who did not lie to save his job and did not exaggerate to keep it. His notebook, recovered later, was written in the short indicative sentences of a man who had learned early that a section boss's notebook can end up in a coroner's hand. On the last page of September, he had written only that the mules were nervous on the night of the 29th, and that the dogs at the cookhouse would not leave the porch. There were 3 dogs. 2 were mongrels the cook had brought up from Duluth. The third was a heavy-shouldered animal of no clear breed that had followed a survey party out of the woods the previous May and had elected, in the manner of certain dogs, to stay with the men who fed it. The cook, Peter Halverson, said later that the 3 dogs had never before refused to walk the perimeter with him at dusk. On the evening of September 29th, they refused. On the evening of September 30th, they refused again. On the evening of October 1st, the 2 mongrels went under the cookhouse and would not come out, and the heavy-shouldered dog stood at the corner of the porch, facing the tree line, and did not move for 4 hours. Halverson did not sleep that night. He wrote nothing down, because he did not write, but he told the story afterward to the priest at Two Harbors in the same sequence 3 separate times, and the priest kept notes. By the morning of October 2nd, the mules would not take the harness. McCrae rode one of the mules out to the flume at first light. It went 400 yards and stopped. He dismounted and led it. It walked another 60 yards, set its feet, and shook, and would not walk. McCrae tied it to a stump and went on alone. When he came back, the mule had chewed through the lead rope at a point above the knot, not where a tied animal chews, and had gone back to the camp on its own. McCrae followed it in and sent 2 men to check the intake in the afternoon. Neither wanted to go. Both went. Both came back within the hour and said the intake was clear. Neither would say what else they had seen. He pressed them separately, after supper, in the section boss's cabin. The first said there was a place near the flume where the moss on a fallen cedar had been pressed down in the shape of something sitting. He said the shape was too long for a man and too wide for a bear, and that the moss was warm. The second said he had found, 30 feet from the flume, on a flat stone in the middle of the creek, the head of a lynx. Placed, eyes open, pointed toward the camp. McCrae wrote in his notebook that night, Halverson right about the dogs, moved the guns into the bunkhouse. There were 2 guns in the camp, a single-shot shotgun the cook used on grouse, and a lever-action .44-40 that had belonged to McCrae's brother, and that McCrae kept oiled in a canvas sleeve under his bunk. He moved both weapons into the bunkhouse and told the men the stable roof was leaking, and anything metal had to come out until it could be patched. The stable roof was not leaking. 2 of the men had worked with him long enough to know that. They said nothing. At 2 in the morning, something walked around the bunkhouse. 9 men were awake for it. They could not agree afterward on whether there had been 1 set of footfalls or 2. They agreed on the weight. They agreed on the length of the stride. They agreed that whatever had walked around the bunkhouse had paused at each of the 3 windows and had breathed against the glass long enough to fog it. At the 3rd window, the breath fogged the glass from a height of a little over 7 feet. No one opened the door. At first light, McCrae walked the perimeter of the bunkhouse alone and found, in the mud at the north wall, the print of a foot. He measured it against his own boot, a size 11. The print was longer than his boot by the length of his hand from wrist to fingertip. 5 toes. The toes had pressed deeper than the heel, the print of something leaning forward to look inside. He went back to the cabin and wrote, "Send Herner a wire. Tell him nothing. Ask for the special detail." Horner's private log records the wire at 7:14 a.m. on October 2nd in company shorthand. 74 requests, special detail, timber matter, urgent, no press. Horner, who had received such wires twice in his career and understood what a timber matter meant when a section boss refused to name the animal, forwarded it to the division superintendent within 4 minutes and wrote in his private log the single word, "again." The special detail existed because the company had needed it before. It had needed it in 1899, at a survey camp on a river the maps have since renamed, when 3 chainmen went missing between one supper and the next and were found 6 days later, all 3, in a stand of white pine a mile from the camp, stacked in a manner the company's report described as incidental to bear activity, and that the 2 men who had actually seen the stack refused ever again to describe. It had needed it in 1902 at a tie-cutting operation on the North Branch, when a foreman was taken through the wall of his own cabin between 1 and 3 in the morning, while 4 men slept in the next room and heard nothing but the sound of the wall giving. It had needed it in 1904 at a water stop, when a brakeman stepped down to relieve himself and was lifted, according to the engineer who watched it from the cab, straight up into the trees along the grade, without a shout, without a struggle, without a shot fired. Each of these events had been closed on the company's books as a bear. The special detail was 6 men. Their names appear nowhere in the company's public records. Horner names 4 of them in his private log. The other 2 can be inferred from pay stubs at the Minnesota Historical Society. They were led by Josiah Renner. Renner had been a market hunter in the Bitterroots before the market for elk hide collapsed, and had come east in 1898 to work for the railroads in a capacity the pay stubs describe as timber liaison. What a timber liaison did was not written down. What Renner did, on the evidence, was travel to the places on the northern grades where section bosses stopped writing in their notebooks and cause those places to be quiet again, by means the company did not require him to itemize. Renner had been to mile 74 before. He had been there in the spring of 1906, when a tie cutter came back to the bunkhouse with a broken jaw and no memory of the last 4 hours of his shift, and was dead of shock by morning. Renner walked the woods around mile 74 for 11 days after that. He wrote a report of 1 paragraph. It survives in a copy Horner made for reasons Horner did not explain, and it reads, "The animal at 74 is not one animal. It is a family group of no fewer than 3, and no more than 5, and it is territorial to a radius I estimate at 4 miles from the flume. It does not attack men who stay on the grade during daylight. It has attacked men who have left the grade, and it has attacked men who have been on the grade at night when the wind was from the north. It understands the schedule of the trains. It has learned to avoid the whistle. I recommend the line be moved 2 miles west, or the camp be closed between the months of September and April. I do not recommend the animal be pursued. J. Renner." The company did not move the line. The company did not close the camp. The company filed Renner's report in a drawer, continued to run its work extras on the existing grade, and paid the men at mile 74 an extra $1 a week without telling them what the extra $1 was for. When McRae's wire came in on the morning of October 2nd, 1907, the division superintendent read it, opened the drawer, took out Renner's 1906 report, read it a second time, and wired Renner at a boarding house in Ashland. The wire, per Horner's private log, said 74 again. Come. Renner was at mile 74 by the evening of October 3rd. By the evening of October 3rd, 3 more men were dead. The flagman was Thomas Bell. He was 26. He had been engaged the previous Christmas to a schoolteacher in Superior. He had walked ahead of the locomotive at 4:30 on a section of grade he had walked more than 100 times, and he had been arranged on the ballast in a manner the fireman, Owen Cask, described in the company statement as laid out. Cask had been on the line for 11 years. He was not the kind of man to say a thing was laid out if it had merely fallen. What he meant by laid out, and what he described in more detail to Horner 2 nights later in the division telegraph office with the door closed, was that Bell's boots pointed east along the ballast in a straight line, that Bell's arms were folded across his chest, with the right hand over the left in the manner of a man in a casket, that Bell's cap had been placed on the ballast 6 inches above the crown of his head, as if hung on a hook, and that Bell's lantern had been set on the ground beside his right knee, still burning, with the wick trimmed short enough that it would burn for hours without smoking. Bell's neck had been broken. His head was turned 180 degrees from his shoulders, so that his face pointed at his heels. The company doctor, whose private notes survive in the archive at the county courthouse, wrote that the vertebrae had been separated cleanly at a joint above the shoulders, and that the surrounding tissue was not torn, but rotated, as if the head had been unscrewed rather than wrenched. He had seen the results of bear attacks 8 times in his career. This was not one of them. He did not know what it was. The second body was found at 9, half a mile north, by Otto Lind. Lind had been sent up the grade with 2 others to look for a switchman named Kalle Ranta, who had not returned from a routine walk to a signal box. Ranta was in the signal box. He was seated on the small stool inside. His hands were folded in his lap. The door was closed. The window was closed. There was no blood inside the box. Ranta's chest had been compressed. The company doctor wrote that every rib on both sides of the sternum had been broken in the same place, in a single event, by a pressure applied evenly across the front of the body. He wrote that the pressure had not been applied by a fall or by a blow, but by an embrace. He wrote the word and underlined it, and then he added, in a different ink, and in a hand that appears to have been unsteady, he was picked up and squeezed and put back. The signal box was locked from the inside. The third body was found by Renner, half an hour after Renner arrived at the camp. It was Halvorson. He had been alive at breakfast. He had served eggs and salt pork and coffee to 17 men, washed the pans, and gone out to the woodpile behind the cookhouse to split kindling for supper. He was at the woodpile less than 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes he had been lifted from the packed earth beside the woodpile, carried 92 feet through a stand of young spruce without breaking any of the branches at the height a man's body would break them, and placed on a flat rock at the edge of a small clearing Renner had walked past the previous spring. Halvorson was intact. He was not marked. His clothing was not torn. His pipe was in his mouth. The pipe was still warm. He was dead. Renner examined the body without touching it. He walked a circle at 20 feet and looked at the ground. He walked a second circle at 40. On the second circle, due north of the rock, he found the print of a foot in the moss. He measured it against a pencil he carried for the purpose. He wrote in his own notebook, which survives in a private collection in St. Paul. Adult male. Larger than the one in 1906. Second set of prints at 42 feet. Smaller. Adult female. Third set at 60 feet. Juvenile. Family present. They brought Halvorson out here for us to find. He closed the notebook and walked back to the camp and told McCrae to put every man in the bunkhouse before dark and to bar the door. McCrae asked why Halvorson had been placed on the rock. Renner said, according to McCrae's notebook, that he had been placed on the rock because the family wanted the men at the camp to understand that the family could take any man they wanted, at any hour, from any part of the camp, and put him wherever they liked, and that the family was telling the men this in the only language the family had. McCrae wrote the sentence down in Renner's exact words, and underlined it, and then he wrote beneath it, "They are not warning us to leave. They are showing us we cannot." Renner spent the afternoon of October 3rd walking the grade. He walked alone. He carried a .45-70 rifle, a canvas satchel of cartridges, a compass, a pencil, and a small notebook bound in oilcloth. He did not carry a lantern. A lantern in that country after dark was a signal, and a signal in that country after dark was answered. He walked north from the camp for 2 miles. He stopped at each telegraph pole and looked at the base of the pole and at the ground on the west side of the grade, which was the side the wind was coming from. At the 7th pole, he stopped for a long time. At the 9th pole, he stopped for longer. At the 11th pole, he turned around and walked back to the camp at a pace that was, according to a brakeman who saw him arrive, the pace of a man who did not want to look as if he were hurrying. He went into the section boss's cabin, closed the door, sat down across from McCrae, and put his notebook on the table between them. He said the family had been moving parallel to the grade for at least 6 days. He said the family had been eating well before the men began to die, because the deer sign west of the grade had gone quiet, and the crow sign had thickened over 3 particular stands of timber that he named by their compass bearing from the camp. He said the family had killed at least 2 deer and 1 moose in the week before October 1st, and had cached what it had not eaten by covering the meat with cut boughs weighted with stones. He had found one cache at the 7th pole and a second at the 9th. He had not disturbed either. He said the family had not begun with the men. He said the family had begun with the mules. On the night of September 29th, by standing near the stable at a distance the mules could smell but not see, and had progressed to the dogs on the nights of September 29th through October 1st, by circling the cookhouse at distances that decreased each night by roughly 40 feet, and had progressed to the men on the night of October 1st, when it had come to the bunkhouse and breathed on the glass at each of the 3 windows. He said the family had a schedule. He said the schedule was the schedule of the trains. McCrae asked him to explain. Renner said the northbound work extra came through mile 74 at 4:20 a.m. He said the southbound came through at 11:40 p.m. He said the family had done its work on the men in the windows between the trains and had not been seen from any train because the family knew when the trains were coming and moved off the grade before the headlamp came around the curve at mile 73. He said this was not the behavior of a bear. He said this was not the behavior of any animal in his experience, except one. McCrae asked what animal. Renner did not answer. He asked McCrae instead how many men were on the roll. McCrae said 23. Renner asked how many were accounted for at that moment. McCrae checked his book. 20. Renner asked what had happened to the other 3. Bell on the grate at the north end. Ranta in the signal box at the north end. Halverson at the woodpile behind the cookhouse at the south end. Renner sat with this for a full minute. Then he asked McCrae for a map of the camp. There was no map. McCrae drew one on the back of a supply requisition. He drew the bunkhouse, the cookhouse, the tool shed, the stable, the section boss's cabin, the water tank, the flume, the grade, the 2 signal boxes, the woodpile, the outhouse, and the path from the woodpile to the outhouse. Renner looked at the map for a full minute. Then he took the pencil from McCrae's hand and drew a circle around the camp at a radius that took in every building and the near end of the grade, and he tapped the center of the circle with the pencil and said, according to McCrae's notebook, that the family was inside the circle. McCrae asked what he meant. Renner said the family was no longer moving parallel to the grade. The family had come across the grade in the night of October 2nd and was now on the east side, which was the side of the camp itself, and had established a position in the timber east of the stable from which it could observe every building in the camp at once. He had seen the position from the 11th pole. The position had been prepared. Cut boughs arranged into what he called a watch nest at the base of a large hemlock, and the ground within the nest packed flat by long use. McCrae asked how long the position had been there. Renner said, and this is written twice in McCrae's notebook, in the same words both times, as if McCrae had wanted to be certain, at longer than the camp. They put every man in the bunkhouse an hour before dark. Renner posted himself at the north window with the .45-70. He posted McCrae at the south window with the .44-40. He posted a young brakeman named Siver Aho at the east window with the cook's shotgun, loaded with buckshot. He told Aho to look for movement at ground level and not to look higher than 10 feet, unless he saw movement at ground level first. A man who watches for something above his head will not see what walks in front of him. He told the men in the bunks to sleep in their boots. He told them not to open the door for anyone, including him, unless the person on the other side of the door said the word Ashland. He did not explain what the word was. He said only that if the person on the other side of the door did not say the word, they were to put the barrel of any available firearm against the door and fire through it at the height of a man's chest, and continue firing until the person on the other side of the door was silent. He put out the lamps. At 41 minutes past 10, the northbound work extra came through and did not stop. The headlamp swept the grade and moved on. The sound of the locomotive receded to the north for 11 minutes. and then it could not be heard at all. At 11 minutes past 11, the dog on the porch of the cookhouse began to whine. The whine was audible in the bunkhouse. It was a high sound, held for a long breath, and released and taken up again. Renner did not turn his head. McCrae did not turn his head. Aho turned his head, and Renner said to him without looking, in a voice the men in the bunks could hear, "Face your window." Aho faced his window. At 22 minutes past 11, the dog on the porch of the cookhouse stopped whining. It did not resume. There was no other sound. At 6 minutes to midnight, something struck the west wall of the bunkhouse. The blow was single and heavy. It produced a resonance in the log wall that Ivar Sundqvist, who was in the third bunk from the west wall, later described as the resonance of a large door being closed by someone who was not angry. The blow did not repeat. Renner did not speak. McCrae did not speak. Aho did not speak. 11 seconds after the blow, at a position roughly 20 feet north of the point of impact, something struck the west wall a second time. Same weight. Did not repeat. 11 seconds after that, at a position roughly 20 feet north of the second blow, something struck the west wall a third time. Renner said in the same voice, without turning, "They are counting the wall." At 3 minutes to midnight, at the south wall, at a height Sundqvist later estimated by the resonance of the log at somewhere between 7 and 8 feet from the ground, a fingernail was drawn across the wood. Slowly, from the corner of the wall nearest the door to a point roughly halfway along the wall. Then it stopped. Then it was drawn back to the corner. Then it was drawn from the corner to the same halfway point. The pattern was the pattern of a man measuring a plank. McCrae, at the south window, later said that he understood in the third repetition of the sound that the fingernail was not looking for something. It was letting the men inside the bunkhouse hear it look. At 1 minute to midnight, the southbound consist came through, 40 minutes ahead of its scheduled 11:40. Renner had known it would. He had wired Horner from the division telegraph the previous evening and had asked Horner to bring the southbound forward by 40 minutes without telling the crew why. Horner had done it. The headlamp of the southbound came around the curve at mile 73 at a moment none of the animals outside the bunkhouse had expected. It swept the west side of the grade at a range of 200 yards, and it caught, at a point roughly opposite the west wall of the bunkhouse and at a distance of perhaps 60 feet into the timber, 3 shapes. The engineer of the southbound was Adalbert Voss. He had been on the northern grades for 22 years. He gave a statement to the company on October 5th and a longer statement to Horner in private on October 7th, and the 2 statements agree on the following points. The 3 shapes were standing. They were standing on 2 legs. The tallest was, in Voss's estimation, no less than 7.5 feet, and no more than 8.25. The second was shorter by perhaps a foot. The third was shorter than the second by roughly the same margin. The tallest was in front. The other 2 were behind and to either side, in the arrangement of adults flanking a child. Though which of the 3 was the child, Voss did not say, because the height of the third was still the height of a large man. The 3 shapes did not move when the headlamp caught them. They did not turn away. They did not shield their eyes. They watched the train pass. Voss said the eyes of the tallest reflected the headlamp in the manner of the eyes of an owl or a deer, brightly and evenly, and at the same instant, and that the eyes were set forward in the head in the arrangement of a predator and not to the sides in the arrangement of prey. Voss did not stop the train. Horner had told him not to, in the wire that had moved the schedule, under any circumstance. He held the throttle open and passed the camp at speed, and as he passed he saw, in the periphery of the headlamp beam, a 4th shape at the west wall of the bunkhouse, upright, with one hand or something like a hand pressed flat against the logs. The fourth shape turned its face toward the locomotive as the locomotive passed. Voss said he did not sleep for 4 nights afterward. He said the face was not the face of an ape and not the face of a man. He said the face was the face of something that had been watching men for a very long time and had learned what a face was for. He said it had been smiling. Renner did not fire. This is where the story stops being a story about an animal. He had the point, 45-70 at the north window, and a clear line of sight to the 3 shapes for the 4 seconds during which the headlamp held them. He did not fire. McCrae did not fire. Aho did not fire. Aho was at the east window and had no line of sight, and by the time he understood what was happening on the west side of the bunkhouse, the shapes were no longer there. Renner wrote in his notebook that night, after the sun had come up, and after the men in the bunkhouse had counted themselves and found all 20 accounted for, a single sentence that Horner later copied and preserved, and that survives in the trunk in Duluth. I did not fire because they were not the ones I was afraid of. He did not explain the sentence that day. He explained it, in part, 3 days later, when the second family arrived. For the moment, on the morning of October 4th, Renner walked to the west wall of the bunkhouse and stood at the point where the fingernail had been drawn. He measured the mark. Height, 7 feet 11 inches. Length, 3 feet. Made by an instrument the width of a heavy pencil and the hardness of horn. He touched the mark and looked at his finger. A residue on the wood, which he described in his notebook as waxy, faintly resinous, not oil. He did not know what it was. He walked to the point where the 3 blows had struck the wall. In the mud at the base of the wall, at each of the 3 points, a single print. Right foot. Same size, same depth, same individual, walking north along the wall, striking the wall once with a fist or a palm at each of 3 evenly spaced positions. The individual had done it without breaking stride. Renner walked out into the timber west of the bunkhouse to the point where the headlamp had caught the 3 shapes. He found the ground packed and the moss compressed and 3 sets of prints. He measured all 3. He wrote, adult male, adult female, juvenile male. The juvenile male is already 6 feet tall. The family in the timber east of the stable is a different family. There are 2 families here. He walked back to the section boss's cabin and sat down and told McCrae that the situation was worse than he had thought. McCrae asked how much worse. Renner said, and McCrae wrote it down, that the family east of the stable was the family that had killed Bell and Ranta and Halverson, and that the family west of the grade was a family that had arrived on the night of October 3rd from somewhere further north, and that the 2 families were not the same, and that the 2 families knew each other, and that the 2 families had come to mile 74 because mile 74 was on a border they were both interested in. McCrae asked what border. Renner said the border between one family's country and another family's country. He said the border had been there before the railroad. He said the railroad had cut it. He said the railroad had cut it in 1902 when the grade had been pushed north through the stand of white pine, where the 3 chainmen had been stacked in 1899. The border had been quiet for a few years because the family on the west side had been fewer and had withdrawn to the north. But the family on the west side had grown. It had come back. It had brought a juvenile. The 2 families were now on either side of the grade with the camp between them. He said the men at mile 74 were not being hunted. He said the men at mile 74 were being included in a negotiation. McCrae did not understand him, Renner explained. When 2 families of this animal met at a border, they had not decided. They did not fight each other. They did not have the numbers to fight each other. They exchanged evidence of what they were capable of. They killed something and arranged it. They let the other family see the arrangement. The other family then killed something and arranged it in return. The negotiation continued until one family withdrew, or until both families found the arrangement acceptable and shared the border. He said the arrangement of Bell on the ballast had not been for the men at the camp. He said the arrangement of Bell on the ballast had been for the family west of the grade. Ranta in the signal box and Halverson on the rock had also been for the family west of the grade. The family east of the stable had killed the three men, not because they had trespassed, and not because the family was hungry, and not because the family was afraid, but because the family east of the stable had needed to show the family west of the grade what it could do, and the men at the camp were the most convenient material to hand. He said the men at the camp were the currency. He said the family west of the grade had come to the timber opposite the bunkhouse on the night of October 3rd to inspect the currency, and to consider whether the family east of the stable had shown enough, and to decide whether to answer with a killing of its own or to withdraw. He said the fingernail on the south wall had been the family west of the grade, counting the bunkhouse. He said the counting was not finished. The 5 other men of the special detail arrived at mile 74 on the afternoon of October 4th, on a light engine Horner had arranged out of the division yard without paperwork. Their names, per Horner's private log, were Petter Sundgren, Emil Halloran, John Bax, a man Horner records only as the Finn, and a 6th Horner declined to write down, and whom the pay stubs identify as one Elias Vargas. They came armed with 4.45-7s, 2.30-30s, a shotgun of unusual bore, and a quantity of dynamite in a pine crate packed in sawdust. They had been chosen for this work because each of them, per Renner's report of the previous year, could shoot a target he could not entirely see and not talk about it afterward. They did not shoot anything on the afternoon of October 4th. Renner had them dig. He had them dig a trench along the west side of the bunkhouse at a distance of 6 feet from the wall, 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, 40 feet long, and had them fill the bottom with the sharpened ends of split cedar the men at the camp had been cutting for ties. He had them dig a second trench along the east side, a third along the north, a fourth along the south. He had them cover the trenches with a thin lattice of cut brush the color of the ground. He had them run a length of telegraph wire along the top of each trench at a height of 8 inches and fasten a small bell from the camp supply to the wire at intervals of 6 feet, and muffle each bell with a wad of felt so that the bell would not ring in the wind but would ring if the wire were pushed. He had them build no walls, no palisade, no visible defense. He had them do the work in the last 3 hours of daylight and cover the disturbed earth with moss and needles cut from the timber to the east. When they were finished, the ground around the bunkhouse did not look disturbed to a man walking past it in daylight, and it did not look disturbed to Renner himself when he walked around the bunkhouse at dusk to inspect it. He said to McCrae that the trenches would not stop the animals. The animals would recognize the trenches immediately and would step over them. The trenches were not for stopping. They were for slowing and for telling. The animals had been counting the bunkhouse the previous night because they had been considering the bunkhouse as a container. The trenches were to make the container harder to open. He said that by the following morning the family east of the stable would understand that the container had been reinforced. The family east of the stable would then be required to answer because the family west of the grade would be watching to see whether the family east of the stable could still deliver. He said, and McCrae wrote it down, "They will kill more of us tonight. They will kill more of us tonight because we made the container harder. They must show the ones west of the grade that they can still open it." He said the men at mile 74 were now inside the negotiation whether they wished to be or not. He said the only remaining question was whether the negotiation would end with the withdrawal of one of the families or with the exhaustion of the currency. He did not need to say what the exhaustion of the currency meant. McCrae wrote, 20 men left. Ask Horner to hold the line closed for a week. He wired Horner at dusk. Hold line 74, closed 7 days. No press. No relief train. Horner held the line. By midnight on October 4th, 2 more men were dead. The 2 men were Sever Aho and Ivar Sundqvist. Aho was the young brakeman who had faced his window when Renner told him to. Sundqvist was the man who had listened to the fingernail on the south wall and had understood, in the 3rd repetition of the sound, that it was letting him hear it. They were not killed inside the bunkhouse. They were killed in the stable. At 40 minutes past 10 on the night of October 4th, one of the 4 draft horses began to scream. The horses had been kept in the stable throughout the previous nights and had been fed and watered inside so that no man would need to leave a building after dark. And this arrangement had held on the nights of October 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. On the night of October 4th, the arrangement failed because the horse that began to scream did not stop, and the other 3 horses joined it, and the sound of 4 draft horses screaming at once inside a wooden building in a quiet forest is a sound that a man who has heard it does not describe accurately, because the sound does not stay in the memory as a sound. It stays as a physical pressure in the chest. The stable was 40 yards from the bunkhouse. Renner had not put a man in the stable. He had told McCrae that the stable was not defensible and that the horses were not the currency. He had told McCrae that if the animals came for the horses, the men were to stay in the bunkhouse and let the horses go. Aho and Sundqvist did not stay in the bunkhouse. Aho had grown up on a farm north of Duluth and had known the horses at mile 74 since he had helped bring them up the previous summer. Sundqvist had not known the horses well, but he had known Aho, and when Aho put on his coat and picked up the shotgun and unbarred the door, Sundqvist picked up an axe from the wood box and followed him out. Renner was at the north window. He did not stop them. McCrae, at the south window, did not stop them. Whether Renner and McCrae saw them go, or the 2 men slipped past in the dark, cannot be resolved, because none of the men who were in the bunkhouse that night would speak about it afterwards, except in the vaguest terms. They crossed the 40 yards in something less than 15 seconds. This is known because Renner counted. He heard the door of the bunkhouse open and close, and he counted, in the voice of a man reading a manifest, from 1, and he was at 15 when the door of the stable opened, and he was at 16 when the screaming of the horses changed. The horses had been screaming in the manner of animals in fear. At the count of 16, the horses began to scream in the manner of animals in pain. The pain scream lasted 11 seconds. It ended not gradually but all at once, in the manner of an orchestra ending a movement on a single stroke, and after it ended, there was a silence in which Renner could hear, through the open bunkhouse window, a sound he later described as a low breathing, not of the horses. The breathing lasted 40 seconds. After the breathing, there was a sound Renner recorded as one dragging. After the dragging, there was silence. Renner did not leave the bunkhouse. He held the point 45-70 on the north window and did not move, and at first light, he walked out with McCrae and Halloran and Bax and the Finn, and they went to the stable. The door of the stable was closed. The door had been closed from the outside. Halloran was the first to reach it. He put his hand on the door and paused and said, according to McCrae's notebook, they shut it behind them. They opened the door. The 4 draft horses were on the floor of the stable. Each of them had been killed by a single downward blow between the ears. The blows had cracked the skulls in an identical pattern. The horses had not been eaten. They had not been dragged. They had been left where they had fallen, in the 4 stalls in which they had been standing. Aho was not in the stable. Sundqvist was not in the stable. The shotgun was on the floor near the door, unfired, both barrels still loaded. The axe was on the floor near the shotgun. Neither weapon had been used. Halloran, who had walked the far end of the stable, called Renner over to the last stall on the east side. In the packed earth of the stall, at the base of the east wall, there was the print of a foot. The foot had stood in the stall, while the horse in the stall had died. The print was pressed deep enough that the animal that had made it had been supporting a weight considerably in excess of its own, which is to say the animal had been carrying something when it stood there. The something, on the balance of the evidence, and on Renner's reading of the sign outside the stable, had been Aho and Sundqvist. The animal had gone out the back of the stable through a section of wall that had been pushed outward without breaking, in the manner of a section of wall, pushed outward by a shoulder, applied evenly across 3 boards. The boards were bowed. They were not splintered. They had been eased. Renner walked out through the gap and followed the trail. The trail went east through the timber for 140 paces, and then it stopped. And at the point where it stopped, there was a low mound of cut boughs, weighted with 3 stones. And beneath the boughs, when Renner lifted them, were Aho and Sundqvist. They had not been eaten. They had been arranged. Aho on the bottom, Sundqvist on top. Both men's arms folded across their chests, right hand over left. Both eyes closed. Both mouths closed. No visible injury, except for a mark at the base of the skull, in the same position on both bodies, where a pressure had been applied by a thumb the size of a doorknob and had entered the soft tissue behind the ear and had reached the brain. The mark was identical on both men. The mark had been made by the same thumb. Renner covered the bodies again with the boughs and the stones, in the arrangement in which he had found them, and walked back to the camp, and wrote in his notebook the following. The family east of the stable has answered. It has doubled the offering. It has shown the family west of the grade that it can take 2 men from a defended building without a sound, and can kill 4 horses without waking anyone else, and can arrange the bodies within 140 paces of the buildings without being seen. The answer will now come from the family west of the grade. The answer will come tonight or tomorrow night. I do not know what the answer will be. I know it will be larger than the offering. J.R. Asterisk. He closed the notebook. He went into the section boss's cabin and told McCrae to have the men load every rifle in the camp and to distribute the dynamite among the buildings and to prepare for a thing he could not name, and he sat down at the table and put his head in his hands. McCrae, who had worked the northern grades 18 years and had not seen Renner do such a thing before, wrote in his notebook only, "He is afraid." The answer came on the night of October 5th. It did not come to the camp. It came to the train. At 11 minutes past 11, a northbound work extra out of the division yard, running under the light of a 3/4 moon, entered the cut at mile 73 on the standard timetable. The engineer was Ansgar Vike. The fireman was Corbin Rask. There were 4 other men in the caboose. They were not railroad men. They were 3 journalists from a Minneapolis paper and a photographer with a plate camera. They had come north because a rumor had reached the paper of a closure on the northern line that the company would not explain, and they had bribed a yardmaster in Duluth to put them on the northbound work extra, with an assurance from the yardmaster that they would be at mile 74 by midnight. Horner had not known about the journalists. The yardmaster had not asked his permission. The train entered the cut at 11 minutes past 11. The train did not exit the cut. At 40 minutes past 11, Horner noted in his private log that the northbound had not reported at the checkpoint north of mile 73, and that the checkpoint operator, Wendell Prosser, had wired to ask whether the northbound had been held. Horner wired back that the northbound had left the division yard on schedule and should have passed the checkpoint at 11:33. Prosser wired at 11:47 that no train had passed and that he could hear no train on the grade to the south. Horner wired Renner at mile 74. Renner was in the section boss's cabin. The telegraph key was in the camp office adjacent to the cabin, and the operator was a young man named Alvar Bierke, who had come up from Two Harbors the previous week. Bierke received Horner's wire at 11:52 and walked it to Renner. Renner read it. He walked out to the south end of the grade with McCrae and Halloran and the Finn, and looked down the line toward the cut at mile 73. He could not see the headlamp. He could not hear the locomotive. The locomotive was 3/4 of a mile away, and should have been audible at that distance on a still night. The night was still. The locomotive was not audible. Renner said, and McCrae recorded it, they took the train. McCrae said no animal takes a train. Renner said, they did not take the locomotive. They took what was on it. They walked down the grade toward mile 73. They walked for 11 minutes, and they found the northbound stopped on the grade at a point roughly halfway through the cut. The locomotive was standing on the rails with the boiler at pressure and the headlamp burning. The fire in the firebox had been damped. The throttle had been closed. The brake had been set. Vike was in the cab. He was seated on the fireman's bench with his hands on his knees. He was not injured. He was not able to speak. Rask was not in the cab. The 3 journalists were not in the caboose. The photographer was not in the caboose. The caboose door was open. The plate camera was on the floor. It had been set down carefully. The lens cap was on. The tripod was folded beside it. The photographer's satchel of glass plates was on the bench, closed and buckled. There was no blood in the caboose. There was no blood on the grade. Renner walked the length of the train from the locomotive to the caboose and back. He walked the west side of the grade. He walked the east side. On the east side, at a point roughly opposite the caboose, at a distance of perhaps 30 feet into the timber, he found 5 sets of prints. 4 sets were men in boots. The 5th was the animal. The 4 sets of men's prints did not lead into the timber. The 4 sets of men's prints led out of the caboose to a point roughly 10 feet from the grade, and stopped. They did not continue. They did not turn. They did not scuffle. They stopped in mid-stride, in the arrangement of 4 men walking east in a loose line, and at the point where each of the 4 sets stopped, the print of the animal appeared beside it, 1 print for each man, and then the print of the animal continued east into the timber, deeper than before, at the depth of an animal carrying a considerable additional weight. The animal had carried the 4 men off the grade without any of them running. Renner looked at the prints for a long time. He did not follow them. He walked back to the locomotive. He climbed into the cab. He sat down opposite Vike on the engineer's bench, and he asked Vike, in a voice McCrae later described as gentler than any voice he had heard Renner use, what had happened. Vike said the train had entered the cut on schedule, and that at a point roughly halfway through, at a curve where the grade bent to the northeast, the headlamp had illuminated something standing on the grade in front of the locomotive. He said the something was very large, was standing between the rails, and did not move. He put the brake on and closed the throttle, because he had thought at first that it was a moose. The locomotive had stopped at a distance of perhaps 40 feet from the something. The something had walked around the front of the locomotive at that distance, slowly. It had come around the west side of the locomotive to the cab, put a hand on the running board, and looked into the cab. Rask had stood up. The something had said a word. Vike could not repeat the word. He could not reproduce the sound of it. He said only that the word had not been in English, and had not been in Finnish, or Swedish, or Norwegian, or German, or any of the other languages he had heard men speak on the northern grades, and that when the something had said the word, Rask had climbed down out of the cab on the west side, walked around the front of the locomotive to the east side, and gone into the timber with the something without turning back. Vike had sat in the cab. He had not moved. The something had come back to the running board a second time and looked at him. It had not said anything the second time. It had looked at him for what he estimated at 2 full minutes, then turned and walked to the caboose. He had heard the caboose door open. He had heard nothing else. He had waited what he estimated at 10 minutes, then climbed down and walked back to look at the caboose from the ground. The caboose was empty. Vike had climbed back into the cab and waited. Renner asked him why he had not moved the train. Vike said, and this is the sentence with which Renner ended his account of the interview, because it told me not to. Renner backed the train to mile 74 himself. He put Vike in the caboose with a bottle of the section boss's whiskey and put Halloran on the caboose brake, and he took the locomotive controls, which he had learned in the Bitterroots on a logging line before the market for elk hide had collapsed, and he backed the northbound 3/4 of a mile down the grade to the camp at mile 74, at a speed no greater than walking pace. He did not look at the timber on either side of the grade as he backed the train. He arrived at 3 minutes to 2 in the morning. He put every man in the bunkhouse. He did not post watches at the windows. He sat at the table in the section boss's cabin with McCrae and Sundgren and Bax, and he opened his oilcloth notebook and began to write in a hand that McCrae, watching him, described later as the steadiest hand he had seen Renner use since Renner had arrived. He wrote for an hour. At 3 in the morning he closed the notebook and looked at McCrae across the table and said, in the words McCrae wrote down within the hour, and that Horner later transcribed, the following. The family east of the stable had taken 3 and then 2 men from the camp, from the grade, from the signal box, from the woodpile, from the stable, and had killed them and arranged them within the country the family east of the stable had already claimed. This was ordinary behavior for the animal. The family east of the stable had done this before, at other camps, at other borders, in other years, and had done it in the same way each time. The family west of the grade had done something different. The family west of the grade had stopped a northbound work extra by standing in front of the locomotive. It had approached the cab and induced the fireman to come out and walked the fireman off the grade without touching him. It had then gone to the caboose and induced 3 journalists and a photographer to come out, and had walked them off the grade without touching them, and had done all of this in a manner that had left no blood, no struggle, no sound audible 3/4 of a mile away at the camp. This was not ordinary behavior. This was not the behavior of an animal answering an offering with a larger offering. This was the behavior of an animal that had learned, in some way Renner did not understand, to make men walk off a train without being carried. The family east of the stable, on the evidence, could not do this. The family east of the stable had to carry men off, break their necks or crush their chests, or drive a thumb into the back of their skulls, and arrange them on the ground afterward. The family west of the grade did not have to do any of this. The family west of the grade had said a word. The word had made a man climb down out of a locomotive. He said he did not know what animal could make a man climb down out of a locomotive by saying a word. He said he had told McCrae on the afternoon of October 3rd that the men at mile 74 were the currency of a negotiation between 2 families. This was still true. He had told McCrae that the negotiation would end with the withdrawal of one family or with the exhaustion of the currency. This was no longer true. The negotiation would end with the withdrawal of the family east of the stable. The family east of the stable would understand from the answer at mile 73 that the family west of the grade was capable of a thing the family east of the stable was not. It would understand that further offerings would not be answered in kind. It would leave the country by the following night. The family west of the grade would remain. The country was now the country of the family west of the grade. The family west of the grade had established this in a single evening by taking 5 men off a stopped train without a sound. The family east of the stable had understood it before Renner had, because it had spent longer looking at the family west of the grade than Renner had, and it had known already what the word on the running board would do. The men at mile 74 were not in danger from the family east of the stable any longer. The men at mile 74 were in danger from the family west of the grade, in a way for which he had no procedure. McCrae asked what he meant by no procedure. Renner said his procedure, since 1898, had been to identify the animal, to identify the territory, to identify the schedule, and to remove the men from the intersection of the three. He said this worked when the animal was territorial. It worked when the animal was predatory. It worked when the animal was intelligent within the range of intelligence he had observed in bears and wolves and cats. The animal west of the grade was not within that range. The animal west of the grade had spoken. He said he did not know what to do with an animal that spoke. The family east of the stable withdrew on the night of October 6th. Renner and the Finn walked the timber east of the stable at first light on October 7th and found the watch nest at the base of the hemlock empty. The moss inside the nest was cold. The prints leading out of the nest went northeast, uphill, along a ridge that ran toward the country the maps had not fully surveyed, and the prints did not double back. Renner walked the trail for 2 miles. It continued northeast at a steady pace, without cache, without pause, without arrangement. The family east of the stable was gone. Renner did not believe they had been driven away by the men at the camp. He believed they had been driven away by the family west of the grade. He wrote in his notebook, on the morning of October 7th, that the family east of the stable had lived in the country east of mile 74 for at least 20 years, and probably longer, and had held its border against the family west of the grade for at least the previous 7 years, and had lost the border in a single night because the family west of the grade had learned a thing the family east of the stable had not learned, and had used it, and had made the outcome of any further negotiation obvious. He wrote, "The thing they learned is speech. They did not learn it from us. We would not have taught it. They learned it from listening." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. By the afternoon of October 7th, the men at mile 74 could feel the difference in the country. The dogs came out from under the cookhouse. The 2 mongrels sat on the porch. The heavy-shouldered dog walked the perimeter with a stiffness that was not fear, but was not ease either. The mules would take the harness. The horses were dead, but the mules would take the harness. The men could leave the bunkhouse in daylight and walk to the outhouse and to the flume and to the tool shed without the sensation McCrae recorded in his notebook as being red. The sensation did not disappear entirely. It moved. It moved to the west. McCrae walked the west edge of the grade at noon on October 7th and stood on the ballast and looked into the timber. He wrote that the timber west of the line felt attended to in the same manner the timber east had felt attended to on October 2nd, and that the attention was not hostile in the way the attention on October 2nd had been hostile, and that the attention was in some way worse. He wrote, "The east ones wanted us. The west ones do not want us. They are considering us." He wrote, "I do not know which is worse." Renner did not disagree. Renner spent October 7th preparing the men at mile 74 to leave the camp. He wired Horner and instructed him to send a light engine on the morning of October 8th to take 20 men and 2 bodies and the dogs to the division yard at Duluth, without a caboose, without a fireman other than the one on the engine, passing through mile 73 at the highest speed the grade would allow, not stopping under any circumstance between the division yard and mile 74. Horner agreed. Renner did not tell the men at the camp that they were leaving. He told McCrae only, and he told McCrae only at 10 o'clock on the night of October 7th, and he told McCrae to say nothing to the men until the light engine had entered the cut at mile 73 on the morning of the 8th. The family west of the grade did not need to be told the camp was being abandoned. The family west of the grade would infer it from the men's movement toward the grade at the arrival of the light engine, and would have exactly the length of time between the arrival of the light engine at mile 74 and its departure to decide what to do. He said he did not know what the family west of the grade would decide. He said the decision would depend on whether the family west of the grade had, in the taking of the 5 men from the train, exhausted the negotiation it had begun, or had merely begun a negotiation of a different kind. He said he suspected the second. He said he suspected it because of the 4th shape at the west wall of the bunkhouse on the night of October 3rd. He said the 4th shape had smiled. He said he had not written this down previously because Voss's report of the smile had come to him only on October 6th, in a wire Horner had forwarded from Voss's statement at the division yard, and he had not wanted to record the observation without corroboration. He said the corroboration had come. Aho and Sundqvist, when he had lifted the boughs off them on the morning of October 5th, had been arranged with their eyes closed and their mouths closed. And this had been true of Bell on the ballast, and of Ranta in the signal box, and of Halverson on the rock. The 4 men taken from the train on the night of October 5th, if they were found, would not be arranged that way. The 4 men taken from the train on the night of October 5th would be arranged with their mouths open. McCrae asked why. Renner said the family east of the stable arranged the bodies to be looked at. He said the family west of the grade arranged the bodies to be listened to. He said he did not know what a man arranged to be listened to would look like because he had never found one, but he said he was afraid he would find one before the light engine arrived, and he said he hoped he would not. He did not find one. The men taken from the train on the night of October 5th were never found. The company sent a search party into the timber east of mile 73 on the morning of October 9th, after the light engine had taken the men at mile 74 to Duluth. The search party walked the country for 4 days and found nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no bones. What it found, at a point roughly 2 miles east of the grade, was a clearing of perhaps 40 feet across in which the moss had been pressed flat in a circle at the edge, in the arrangement of a number of large animals having sat around the perimeter for a considerable length of time, and in the center of the clearing, nothing at all. The company doctor who examined the site wrote in his private notes that the clearing had the appearance of a meeting place, and that whatever had met there had left without leaving any physical trace of the meeting, and that this was not an animal behavior he could account for. He wrote, "If men had done this, we would call it a court." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The light engine arrived at mile 74 at 7 minutes past 9 on the morning of October 8th, 1907. The engineer was Adalbert Voss, who had asked to make the run, who had not slept for 4 nights, and whose statement about the smile at the west wall of the bunkhouse would not be given to Horner in private until the following evening. He brought the engine into the camp at a walking pace and stopped it opposite the bunkhouse with the boiler at pressure and the throttle in his hand. The men came out of the bunkhouse in the order Renner had assigned them the previous night. The section boss's cabin was left with its door open. The tool shed was left with its door open. The stable was left with the 4 horses inside and with the section of pushed wall untouched. The cookhouse was left with the stove cold and the pans hung. The bodies of Aho and Sundqvist were carried out of the timber on the east side of the grade at first light by Halloran and Bax and the Finn, wrapped in tarpaulins and placed in the tender on a bed of coal. Bell and Ranta and Halverson had been placed in the tender the previous night, when Renner had had McCrae write in the camp log that a bear had been killed and the men were being withdrawn as a precaution. The camp log entry was in McCrae's hand, signed by McCrae, signed by Renner, signed by Voss when Voss arrived. It was the entry the company would file with the state. It was not accurate. Renner walked the perimeter of the camp one final time. He walked the west side of the grade at a distance of 6 feet from the ballast, from the south end of the camp to the north end and back. He walked the east side. He walked around each of the 4 trenches at the base of the bunkhouse and looked at the wire and the muffled bells. The wire at the west trench had been pushed. At a point roughly opposite the center of the west wall of the bunkhouse, the bell had been lifted off the wire and set on the ground beside the trench. The felt had been removed from the clapper. The bell had been placed upright on the moss with the clapper hanging free. It had not rung. It had been removed from the wire without ringing. Renner did not touch it. He walked past it and continued around the bunkhouse. At the north trench, at a point roughly opposite the door of the section boss's cabin, a second bell had been removed in the same manner and placed on the ground. At the east trench, opposite the stable, a third. At the south trench, opposite the door of the bunkhouse itself, a fourth. The 4 bells formed a square around the bunkhouse. Renner looked at each in turn and did not touch any of them. He walked back to the light engine. He climbed into the cab beside Voss. He said, in a voice Voss later recorded, "Go." Voss opened the throttle. The light engine pulled out of mile 74 at 9:09 on the morning of October 8th, with 20 living men in the cab and in the tender, and with 5 bodies in the coal, and with Voss at the throttle, and Renner beside him, and with the dogs on the running board of the cab, the 2 mongrels between Halloran's legs, the heavy-shouldered dog standing on its own at the front of the running board, with its face into the wind. The heavy-shouldered dog did not look at the timber as the engine pulled out. It looked forward, down the grade, in the direction of Duluth. None of the men on the engine looked at the timber either. Renner did not turn his head to look back at the camp as the engine cleared the north end. He kept his eyes on the grade in front of the locomotive, and he counted the telegraph poles as the engine passed them. And when the engine entered the cut at mile 73 at a speed of 38 miles an hour, which was as fast as Voss could push it, Renner stopped counting. He wrote in his notebook that night in a boarding house in Duluth, the final entry for the case at mile 74. It survives in the private collection in St. Paul. Horner never saw it. In the cut at mile 73, on the west side of the grade, at a point roughly halfway through, standing between 2 large hemlocks at a distance of perhaps 30 feet from the ballast, there was an animal of the family west of the grade. It was standing on 2 legs. It was watching the engine pass. It did not follow. It did not move. It was the same one Voss described from the night of October 3rd. It was smiling. I saw its teeth. Its teeth are the teeth of an animal that eats meat. I do not know why it smiles. I do not think it smiles for the reasons a man smiles. I think it smiles because it has learned that smiling is what a face is for, and it wants us to know it has learned. J. Renner. Below the entry, in a different ink, in a hand that appears to have been written some time later, Renner added, "It waved." The company reopened the line at mile 74 on the morning of October 15th, 1907. It did so with a crew of 28 men brought up from Duluth on a special consist. None of the 28 had been at mile 74 in the first week of October. None of them were told what had happened. Each was paid an extra $1 a week without being told what the extra $1 was for. The company filed the following with the state over the signature of the division superintendent on October 12, 1907, that a bear of considerable size, believed to have been driven south from the country north of the grade by an early winter, had entered the camp at mile 74 on the night of October 2nd and had killed 1 man. That further attacks on the nights of October 3rd and 4th had accounted for 6 additional deaths. That the animal had been killed by a special detail on the night of October 5th near mile 73. That the camp had been closed for a week as a precaution, and that the line had been reopened without further incident. The bear was not produced. The report noted that the carcass had been left in the timber, in accordance with the practice of the northern grades, and that the men of the special detail had verified the kill. The report was accepted. The state did not inquire further. The families of the 7 dead men were paid the standard death benefit, $120 per man, and were told that the men had been killed by a bear. Bell's fiancée in Superior was told this in a letter signed by the division superintendent. Halverson's sister in Two Harbors was told this by the priest at Two Harbors, who had heard Halverson's story about the dogs and did not believe the letter, and told Halverson's sister only that Pater had died quickly and had not suffered, which was not accurate, but which was kind. The 4 men taken from the train on the night of October 5th were not included in the report. The 3 journalists were listed by their paper as missing on assignment, and the paper did not investigate further because the yardmaster in Duluth, who had put the journalists on the northbound, had been discharged on October 9th and had left the state on October 11th, and the paper had no other source at the division yard. The photographer was listed by his agency as missing. Rask, the fireman, was listed by the company as having deserted his post at mile 73 in violation of his contract, and his pay was withheld from his family for 4 months and then released without explanation. Horner remained at the division telegraph office until 1912, when he retired at his own request and moved to Duluth. He kept his private log in a trunk in the attic of his house on 6th Street until his death in 1946, when the trunk was closed and moved by his daughter to a storage room. It was opened in 1968 by his granddaughter, who was preparing to sell the house and who read the log for the first time. The log was donated to the Minnesota Historical Society in 1971. It was cataloged in 1974. It was not read by any researcher until 1993, when a graduate student named Marion Kessler, working on a thesis about the Northern Lines, requested it from the archive and read it in a single sitting, and wrote in her research notes that she believed the log to be a private embellishment by a lonely telegrapher, and that the events described in it were not credible. She was not aware of Renner's notebook, which had passed by inheritance to a private collector in St. Paul in 1958, and was not made available to researchers until 2011. She was not aware of McCrae's notebook, which was found in a barn near Two Harbors in 1989 and purchased by the same collector in 1994. She was not aware of Voss's private statement to Horner, which was in a separate envelope in the trunk and had been catalogued separately and never cross-referenced. When these documents were finally read together, in 2013, by a researcher whose name is not relevant here, the events at mile 74 in the first week of October, 1907, were reconstructed for the first time. The reconstruction did not reach the public. The company that had owned the line in 1907 had been absorbed by a larger company in 1928, and that company by a larger company in 1970, and the successor company held the archives under a right of first review negotiated at the merger. The successor company exercised the right. The researcher signed a non-disclosure agreement as a condition of access. The researcher honored the agreement until his death in 2019. His notes were released to his family in 2021. His family did not know what to do with them. They are the source of the account you have just heard. The camp at mile 74 is not there any longer. The line was moved 2 miles west in 1931 in the course of a general realignment of the northern grade for reasons the company attributed to a soft ground problem in the old cut, and the old grade was pulled up in 1934, and the timber has taken back the ballast. There is nothing at the coordinates where the bunkhouse stood except a slight rectangular depression in the moss and a few pieces of iron the salvagers did not think were worth your worrying out. The country east of the old grade has not been logged. There was interest in the 1920s, and a survey party was sent in the fall of 1923, and the survey party came back in 9 days with a recommendation that the country be left alone on the grounds of poor timber, which was not accurate. The survey foreman was Ostergaard, who had been a brakeman on the Northern Line in 1907 and who had not been at mile 74, but who had known Voss. His recommendation was accepted without review. The country east of the Old Grade has not been logged since. The country west of the Old Grade has been logged in patches, and the patches have grown back. And in the patches that have grown back, there are, at intervals, the local timber crews will not describe to outsiders small clearings in which the moss has been pressed flat in a circle at the edge, in the arrangement of a number of large animals having sat around the perimeter for a considerable length of time, and in the center of the clearings, nothing at all. The crews do not work near the clearings. They do not explain why. The word Vike heard on the running board of the northbound work extra on the night of October 5th, 1907, was not written down by anyone who heard it, because only Vike heard it, and Vike could not reproduce it. Vike lived until 1954. He was interviewed once, in 1948, by a folklorist from the University of Minnesota, who asked him about the events of October 1907, and received a statement of 11 sentences in which Vike said that the newspapers had exaggerated the incident, that a bear had killed some men, that the company had handled it correctly, and that he did not wish to discuss it further. The folklorist noted in the margin that Vike had not slept for the 3 nights preceding the interview. He did not ask Vike why. Rask's descendants, who live in Cloquet, have among their family papers a letter Rask wrote to his mother from the boarding house at the division yard on October 3rd, 1907, 2 days before the night of the train. The letter says only that Rask has been assigned to a northbound work extra out of the yard on the night of the 5th, that the run is expected to be routine, and that he will be home for Sunday supper. The letter is signed Corbin. It was received by Rask's mother on October 6th, the day after the run. Rask's mother kept the letter in a Bible until her death in 1937. The Bible passed to Rask's sister, and then to Rask's niece, and then to Rask's grandnephew, who has the letter now, and who does not know what happened to his great-uncle, and who has been told by the family that Corbin walked off the train at mile 73 in the fall of 1907 and was never seen again, and that this is the whole story. It is not the whole story. The whole story is that Corbin Rask climbed down out of the cab of a stopped locomotive on the night of October 5th, 1907, and walked around the front of the locomotive to the east side and went into the timber with something that had said a word to him, and did not turn back, and was not carried, and was not marked, and was not screaming, and was not resisting, and was, on the reading of the sign at the point where his footprints ended and the animals began, walking of his own accord at the moment he was lifted, in the way a man walks when he has been told to come. The animal that told him to come is still in the country west of the Old Grade at mile 74. It is still there because the family east of the stable withdrew in October of 1907, and the family west of the grade did not. And no other family has come to challenge it. And the border it established in a single night has held for 119 years. The country inside that border has not been surveyed. It has not been logged. It has not been walked by any man whose account has survived. The company that succeeded the company that succeeded the company that owned the line in 1907 still holds the mineral rights to the country inside the border. It has not exercised them. It reviews the holding at intervals of 5 years. The internal memoranda from the reviews, which have appeared in litigation on unrelated matters, use in each instance the same phrase to describe the country inside the border. The phrase is not currently accessible. The phrase is not explained. It does not need to be. The country inside the border is accessible in the sense that a train can pass through it, and a survey can be plotted on paper across it, and a road can be drawn on a map through the middle of it, and a man can be sent into it on foot at any hour of any day. The country inside the border is not accessible in the sense that a man sent into it comes back. At the western edge of the border, at a point that would have been roughly opposite the 11th telegraph pole north of the old camp at mile 74, a hunter from Two Harbors named Kenneth Vano, in November of 2004, took a photograph of a track in the snow. The photograph was published in a local paper. The track was 14 inches long. It was pressed to a depth of 3 inches in snow that had fallen the previous night. 5 toes. The toes had pressed deeper than the heel. Vano did not follow the track. He was asked by the reporter why. He said he had not followed it because at a distance of perhaps 100 yards from where he had photographed it, the track went to the base of a large hemlock, and at the base of the large hemlock, the moss and the snow had been arranged in a shape that was not the shape of an animal lying down. He was asked what the shape was. He said the shape was the shape of an animal sitting. He was asked how he knew it had been sitting. He said, and this was the last sentence of the article as it was published in the Two Harbors paper on November 17th, 2004, because it was waiting for me to catch up. The article was not reprinted. Vano gave no further interviews. He died in 2011 of natural causes in his home in Two Harbors at the age of 73, and among his papers, which were given to the local historical society, was a single page in his hand, undated, which reads only, "I did not photograph the second thing at the tree. I did not photograph it because it was watching me photograph the first thing, and I did not want it to know I had seen it. If I had photographed it, it would have followed me home. It did not follow me home." KV. The Historical Society has the page. It is not on display. It is in a folder in a drawer in an office in the back of the building, and the folder is marked with the number of the accession and with the date, and the drawer is closed, and the office is locked at night, and the building is closed on Sundays, and the country west of the old grade at mile 74 is still 119 years after the first week of October 1907, on every map the successor company holds, marked with the phrase "not currently accessible," and the phrase is not explained, and the phrase does not need to be, and the men who might have explained it are, without exception, no longer available to be asked. The line is quiet. The line has been quiet for a very long time. The country west of the old grade has not been quiet. It has never been quiet. It has been listening since before the grade was cut, and it was listening on the night Voss brought the southbound through the curve at mile 73 and swept his headlamp across the timber and caught 3 shapes standing on 2 legs in the beam. And it was listening on the night Vike stopped the northbound in the cut and heard a word on the running board. And it is listening now. And what it is listening for is not known to anyone alive. And the only man who ever came close to understanding it was Josiah Renner, who stopped writing in his notebook in the spring of 1908 and moved to a farm in Oregon and did not go back into the northern timber for the remaining 29 years of his life. Renner was asked once, in 1934, by a nephew who was preparing to take a job with a lumber company in Idaho, whether there were animals in the northern woods a man should be afraid of. Renner did not answer for a long time. Then he said, according to the nephew's later account, "There are animals in the northern woods that are afraid of you. There are animals in the northern woods that are not afraid of you. And there are animals in the northern woods that have decided about you." The nephew asked what he meant by decided. Renner did not answer. He looked out the window of the kitchen at the farm in Oregon, and he did not answer. And he did not answer for the rest of the afternoon. And he did not answer for the rest of his life. And he died in 1937 without answering, and the country west of the old grade at mile 74 is still there, and the border is still there, and the thing that established the border is still there, and it is still smiling, and it is still on the evidence, waiting for someone to catch up. The line is closed. The case is closed. The country is not.